What's up guys, how are you all doing? I hope you are finding my tutorials useful. So today I am here to start a new tutorial series and I will name it as Amazon API Gateway tutorial. So I'm going to try to keep the tutorial as simple as possible. So the plan is I will start this tutorial series with creation of API endpoint, followed by creating resources, methods and deployment of the API. Further, I will cover the binary media types like how you can upload the CSV or any file using API gateway endpoint. Later, followed by API authorization. So this is what I have in mind at high level, but I could add more things at later point of time. So if you want anything to be added or you want me to do tutorial on anything in terms of API gateway, then please feel free to comment. So welcome to part 1 of tutorial series on Amazon API gateway tutorial. So I'm assuming that you already have logged in into AWS Management Console, and once you are there, navigate to API Gateway. So I have no API gateway created, so it's showing this screen, right? So I'm going to click on Get Started. Now it says Create Example API. So it says welcome to Amazon API Gateway. To create our first API, we have pre-populated import from Apache Store API defined using Swagger 2.0. To get started, close this model and select import in the create API form. So I'm going to say okay, right? So we will come to that part later. So here we will start with choose the protocol. So it says select whether you would like to create a REST API or a WebSocket API. So what is ideally REST API? So a REST API is an application program interface that uses HTTP request to get, put, post and delete data. So ideally in REST API, it receives and responds to request, right? So that's a high level of REST API. Now, WebSocket API ideally supports two-way communication between client application and your backend. So the backend can send callback messages to connected clients, right? So where we can use REST API and where we can use WebSocket API. So I would like to give you an example. So we can use REST API when, for example, we want to expose and manipulate the backend data to be used by any web application or mobile application to get, put, post and delete data, right? Now, ideally, WebSocket API are often used in real-time applications such as chat application, collaboration platform, multiplayer games, and so on, right? So here we are going to select REST API, right, and not the WebSocket API. Then under create new API, it gives us three options, that is new API, import from Swagger or OpenAPI 3 and example API. So I'm going to select new API. So if you have the Swagger API definition ready, then you can select import from Swagger or OpenAPI 3, right? But here I am going to select new API. Now within settings, we have to give the API name. So I will say API endpoint itself. And you can put in the description. I will say API Gateway tutorial series. Now we have endpoint type. So it gives us three options, that is regional, edge optimized and private. So let's see what each option means. So it says regional API are deployed in the current region. So for example, right now my current region is North Virginia. So if I select regional, then it's going to deploy this API in the current region, that is North Virginia. Now the second option is edge optimized. So edge optimized APIs are deployed to the CloudFront network. So earlier edge optimized option was selected by default, right? Then we have private. So private APIs are accessible only from VPCs. So here I'm going to select regional, right? So regional and say create API. Now the API endpoint or the API has been created, right? So we'll go through certain options. So here we have resources. So resources and stages is something that I'm going to cover in the next tutorial, right? So I will just give you a quick example. So here we have resources. So resources is something like www.xyz.com/version2/delete underscore method, right? So that slash delete underscore method is ideally a resource here that we are going to create in the next tutorial. Once the resource has been created, we can create the method under that resource. So for example, for delete underscore method resource, we can select delete as a method under that. Now then we have stages. So this is ideally for deployment like dev stage or prod stage, right? Then we have authorizers. So that is again we are going to cover later, that how we can authorize every call to an API endpoint, right? Then we have predefined gateway responses, that is 500 or maybe 404, right? So here is the list of the default gateway responses. Then we have models. So models ideally represent the data structure of a method's request or response payload, right? So here you can create different models over here. Then probably we have resource policy. So resource policies are JSON policy document that control what actions a user or account can perform on an API and under what conditions. So this basically helps in cross account access to this API, right? So ideally we can also use resource policies to restrict access to certain IP address ranges or CIDR blocks and whatnot, right? Then we have documentation. So you can add documentation here which will help developers understand how to interact with your API, right? So here you have got multiple options, that is create documentation part, import documentation, publish documentation, right? And then finally we have settings. So in settings we have three options, that is API key source. So it says choose the source of your API keys from incoming request. So here we have two options, that how the API key will be delivered, it's via header or via authorizer, so you can select accordingly, right? Then we have content encoding. So content encoding allows API clients to request content to be compressed before sending back in the response to an API request, right? So ideally it supports gzip, deflate and identity, right? So it's the compression types. Then finally we have binary media types. So this option allows you to configure binary support for the API by specifying which media types should be treated as binary types. So ideally API gateway will look at the content type and accept HTTP headers to decide how to handle the body. So for example, if I want to upload a file saying PDF file, right? So and in the header I'm passing content type as application/PDF. So if I want API to consider application/PDF as a binary type, then I need to add that binary media type over here, right? So that's binary media type. So this is something we are going to cover later. So this is what the API looks like at high level, considering all the options that we have. So I have not covered or taken you through in depth for each of the options like resources, stages, authorizers, right? So maybe I will take you in depth probably when we start configuring resources, stages, authorizers, right? So when each of the options comes in our way, I will try to take you through in depth that how we can configure and what we can do. So that's it for now. So in the next tutorial, I will take you through on how to create resources and methods. And last but not least, please don't forget to subscribe and also click on the bell icon to stay up to date with the tutorial series. Thank you so much.